The roar of the crowd felt endless. Freddie Mercury stood beneath the lights, the heat of them pressing against his skin like a second weight. Thousands of voices merged into one vast sound, a living thing that rose and fell with every movement he made. From the outside, it looked like another triumphant night, another chapter in a legendary career. But inside Freddie's body, something was quietly unraveling. He felt it before the song even reached its chorus. A tremor in his legs, a sudden heaviness in his chest. Not pain, not yet, but resistance, as if his body were asking a question his mind had avoided for too long. How much longer? Freddie tightened his grip on the microphone stand, steadying himself as he sang. His voice remained strong, cutting through the stadium with practiced power. The audience heard confidence, control, fire. They could not hear the effort behind it. Each step across the stage required intention now. Each breath came a fraction slower than before. Freddie moved forward anyway, refusing to acknowledge the warning signs flashing beneath the adrenaline. He had never stopped for weakness. The song swelled. The crowd clapped in rhythm. Brian's guitar soared beside him. Everything looked exactly as it always had. And then, without planning it, without dramatics, Freddie's knees gave way. He dropped, not collapsed, not stumbled. He went down deliberately, landing on both knees at the center of the stage. For a heartbeat, the stadium didn't react. Fans thought it was choreography. Another theatrical flourish from a man known for excess and drama. Cameras zoomed in. The crowd screamed louder, feeding the moment with belief. But the band felt it instantly. Brian glanced over, fingers faltering for half a second. Roger froze behind the drums. John stopped moving altogether. This wasn't performance. This was surrender. Freddie stayed there, kneeling beneath the lights, head bowed slightly, one hand gripping the microphone stand for balance. His chest rose and fell unevenly now. Sweat traced slow paths down his face. The song continued, but something had changed. Freddie closed his eyes. The noise faded into something distant, muffled, like sound underwater. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his body, the fatigue, the strain, the truth he had kept hidden beneath bravado and discipline. He thought of all the times he had pushed past limits, all the nights he had told himself one more show wouldn't matter, one more performance wouldn't cost anything. He had been wrong. On his knees, the stage felt different, closer, more real. He could feel its vibration beneath him, hear the raw sound of the crowd without the shield of movement. He was exposed. Freddie lifted his head slowly. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, joy, confusion, awe. None of them knew this might be the last time they would see him like this. Standing tall, commanding, unbroken. A wave of emotion rose in his chest. Not fear, but clarity. This wasn't about collapse. It was about honesty. Freddie brought the microphone closer to his mouth. His voice, when it came, was softer than before, still musical, but stripped of force. The crowd quieted instinctively. In that kneeling position, Freddie Mercury didn't look small. He looked human. The band followed him, adjusting without words. The music softened, bending around his pace. Brian stepped closer, eyes searching Freddie's face, silently asking a question. Freddie gave a slight nod. I'm still here. But inside, he knew something profound had shifted. Kneeling there, he felt the finality of the moment settle over him. Not as panic, but acceptance. He wasn't fighting anymore. He wasn't proving anything. He was choosing how to continue. The crowd began to sing along, gently at first, then stronger, their voices lifting him, carrying the melody forward when his strength wavered. Freddie listened, moved beyond words by the sound of thousands supporting him without knowing why. A lump formed in his throat. For years, he had believed he carried the crowd. Now, the crowd carried him. Freddie remained on his knees through the final notes of the song. When it ended, the applause was thunderous, but different, not celebratory, protective. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. The lights burned above him, unforgiving. His legs trembled when he tried to rise, and for a terrifying second, he wondered if he could. He pushed anyway, slowly, deliberately, Freddie Mercury stood. The stadium exploded. To the audience, it looked like triumph, like drama executed perfectly. Only Freddie knew the truth. That moment on his knees wasn't choreography. It was a warning, a goodbye whispered inside his own body before the world was ready to hear it. As the next song began, Freddie forced a smile, lifting the microphone once more. He would finish the show. He always did. But something inside him had already stepped away from the stage. And as he sang again, a single thought echoed quietly beneath the music. This might be the last time I ever stand here like this. What would happen next? What the crowd would never forget would turn this night into legend. The applause still thundered as Freddie Mercury stepped off the stage, but the moment he crossed into the shadows backstage, the illusion shattered. The noise dulled instantly, replaced by the hum of equipment and hurried footsteps. Freddie's smile faded the second the lights were no longer on him. His shoulders sagged. He leaned heavily against the wall. One hand braced flat against the cool surface as his breathing became shallow and uneven. Brian was at his side in seconds. "Freddie," he said quietly, gripping his arm. "You all right?" Freddie nodded, instinctively, automatically, but the gesture lacked conviction. His legs still trembled from the effort of standing again. The kneeling moment replayed in his mind with unsettling clarity. It hadn't been planned. It hadn't been theatrical. It had been necessary. A medic hovered nearby, eyes sharp with concern. "You shouldn't have gotten back up," she said under her breath. Freddie glanced at her, offering a faint smile. "I wasn't finished." She didn't smile back. "Your body might disagree." Freddie allowed himself to be guided to a chair. The fabric felt unreal beneath him, as if his senses were delayed. Sweat clung to his skin, cooling rapidly now that adrenaline was draining away. On stage, the band carried on without him for a brief instrumental break. The crowd roared, assuming it was part of the show. They had no idea their hero sat just beyond the curtain, head bowed, fighting to regain control of his body. Brian crouched in front of him. "That moment," he said carefully, "when you went down was that—" Freddie met his eyes. "It wasn't planned," Freddie said softly, "but it wasn't an accident either." Brian swallowed. "You scared us." Freddie nodded. "I scare myself." The medic knelt beside him, checking his pulse, shining a light briefly into his eyes. "You're exhausted," she said. "Dangerously." Freddie closed his eyes as the light vanished. "I've been tired before." "This is different," she replied. "Your body didn't stumble. It stopped." The words echoed unpleasantly. Freddie opened his eyes again and stared at his hands. Hands that had just trembled beneath thousands of lights. For years, he had believed discipline could overpower any weakness. That will alone could keep him upright, on his knees. The truth had contradicted him. What did it look like? Freddie asked quietly. Brian hesitated. "From out there?" Freddie nodded. Brian exhaled. "It looked like surrender." Freddie let out a slow breath. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it was. Not defeat. Not collapse. Surrender to reality." The medic straightened. "You need rest. Real rest. Not an hour. Not a night." Freddie looked past her, toward the stage entrance where the sound of the crowd surged again. "After the show," he said, "let me finish." She studied him, weighing risk against resolve. Finally, she nodded. "But I'm staying close." Freddie managed a grateful glance. As the band prepared to bring him back on, Freddie stood slowly, testing his balance. The weakness remained, but so did his resolve. He adjusted his jacket, wiped his face, and took one steadying breath. He wasn't walking back into a performance. He was walking back into a farewell he hadn't yet named. When Freddie returned to the stage, the crowd erupted. He lifted his arm, acknowledging them, but his movements were measured now. Each step deliberate. Each breath counted. The next song was slower, intimate. Freddie sang it differently than ever before, not projecting, but sharing. His voice carried vulnerability that cut deeper than volume ever could. Some fans felt it immediately. Others couldn't explain why tears came so easily. Something had shifted, even if no one understood how or why. Freddie glanced upward once, briefly, as if imprinting the sight of the lights into memory. He wondered if he would ever stand here again feeling this exact weight, this exact mixture of love and limitation. Backstage between songs, Brian leaned close. "They're with you," he said. Freddie nodded. "I know." But the realization carried a bittersweet edge. He had spent his life believing the crowd needed him. Tonight, he understood the opposite. As the show neared its end, Freddie felt the cost of staying upright intensify. Every muscle protested. His vision blurred at the edges. But his mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years. On his knees earlier, he had confronted something unavoidable. This wasn't just fatigue. It was finality approaching quietly. The last song began. Freddie stood center stage once more, microphone steady in his hand. The crowd sang every word back to him, their voices rising in unison. Freddie closed his eyes briefly. He didn't think of legacy. He didn't think of history. He thought of presence. Be here, he told himself. Just be here. As a final note rang out and the applause crashed over him, Freddie bowed deeply. Slower than usual, lower than ever before. For a fraction of a second, it felt like goodbye, but no one realized it yet. As he turned to leave the stage for the final time that night, Freddie felt a sudden, piercing clarity. That moment on his knees hadn't been the end. It had been a signal. And what awaited him after this concert, what his body would soon demand, what his heart already understood, would force him to face a truth far greater than any performance. Because the hardest part of farewell is realize it has already begun. The dressing room door closed softly behind Freddie Mercury, sealing him away from the noise of the stadium one final time that night. Inside, the silence felt heavier than the applause ever had. Freddie stood still for a long moment, his hand resting against the door as if he needed its support to remain upright. The echoes of the crowd still rang faintly in his ears, but they felt distant now, like a memory already slipping into the past. He moved slowly toward the mirror. Under the harsh white lights, there was no illusion left, no flattering shadows, no distance between him and the truth. His face looked thinner. His eyes carried a depth that hadn't been there before, not sadness exactly, but awareness. He lowered himself into a chair, every movement deliberate. His legs trembled again, reminding him of the moment he had gone down on stage. That instant replayed in his mind, the vibration of the floor, the weight of his body, the realization that willpower alone could no longer command everything. For the first time, Freddie did not push the thought away. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and let his head drop into his hands. On his knees, the crowd had cheered. Alone now, he allowed himself to feel what he hadn't let surface then. Fear, not of death, not yet, but of endings, of silence, of stepping away from the place where he felt most alive. He had always believed that as long as he could stand on a stage, he could outrun anything. Illness, time, doubt. That belief had cracked the moment his knees touched the floor. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Brian stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. He didn't speak at first. He simply sat beside Freddie, respecting the gravity of the moment. "You scared them," Brian said softly, "but you also gave them something they'll never forget." Freddie let out a slow breath. "I didn't mean to make a statement." Brian nodded. "Sometimes the body speaks before the mind is ready." Freddie looked up at him. "I knew," he admitted quietly. "The second I went down, I knew." "Knew what?" Brian asked. "That I can't pretend anymore," Freddie replied. "Not to myself." Brian studied him carefully. "What are you afraid of?" Freddie looked back toward the mirror, his reflection meeting his gaze. "That if I stop," he said, "I disappear." Brian shook his head gently. "You're not the stage, Freddie." Freddie smiled faintly. "I've spent my whole life trying to convince myself of that." The silence returned, but it was shared now. Brian eventually stood. "The others are worried. The medic wants to check you again." Freddie nodded. In a minute, after Brian left, Freddie remained seated, breathing slowly. He thought of the crowd, their voices lifting him when his strength had failed. He had always believed he carried them. Tonight, they had carried him. That realization was both beautiful and terrifying. He stood again and walked closer to the mirror, placing both hands on the counter. He leaned in, studying himself. "Who are you?" he whispered softly. "When you're not standing." The question lingered. Freddie straightened and closed his eyes. Images drifted through his mind. Stages across the world, lights exploding into color, moments of triumph that felt eternal at the time. And yet, beneath them all, there had always been exhaustion he refused to acknowledge. Now it demanded recognition. The medic returned, checking his vitals with quiet efficiency. She frowned slightly but said nothing alarming. "You need rest," she said finally. "Not tomorrow. Not after the tour. Now." Freddie nodded slowly. "I know." The admission surprised him. Later, alone again, Freddie wrapped himself in a robe and sat near the edge of the room, listening to the distant hum of dismantled equipment. The concert was over. The night was ending. Something else was ending too. Something less visible. He wasn't ready to name it, but he could feel it. A shift, a closing chapter. Freddie thought of how the crowd would talk about that moment. The kneeling, the pause, the way he rose again. They would mythologize it, turn it into legend. They wouldn't know it had been a conversation between him and his body. A warning spoken clearly at last. As midnight approached, Freddie stood once more, steadying himself. He gathered his things slowly, carefully. When he reached the door, he paused, hand resting on the handle. He looked back at the empty room. For years, he had believed that leaving the stage meant losing himself. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered if leaving might be how he saved what remained. He opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The lights dimmer now, the energy drained. Behind him, the stage waited, silent, patient, indifferent. And Freddie Mercury understood something with painful clarity. That moment on his knees had not been weakness. It had been honesty. And soon, much sooner than the world expected, he would have to decide whether he would keep standing for applause or step away with dignity. The hardest goodbye, he realized, is never spoken aloud. It is felt, and it begins long before the final note. The hotel room was quiet in a way Freddie Mercury rarely allowed. No music played. No voices echoed down the hallway. No celebration followed the show. Freddie sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing his stage clothes, the fabric heavy against his skin now that the adrenaline had faded. Outside the window, the city pulsed with life, unaware and different, as if nothing monumental had happened at all. But inside him, something had closed. He loosened his jacket slowly, every movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. His hand shook slightly as he unbuttoned his shirt. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion layered with clarity, the kind that comes when denial finally runs out of places to hide. Freddie leaned back against the headboard and closed his eyes. On his knees, the image returned again, not as humiliation, not as spectacle, but as truth. His body had spoken plainly, without metaphor or exaggeration. It had said enough. For years, Freddie had believed that stopping meant surrendering everything that made him who he was. Now he was beginning to understand something far more difficult. Stopping might be how he survived what remained. A soft knock came at the door. Brian entered quietly, followed by Roger. Neither carried instruments. Neither smiled. They sat nearby without rushing him, sensing instinctively that words would need to come slowly tonight. "You disappeared," Roger said gently. Freddie nodded. "I needed to hear myself think." Brian studied him carefully. "And—" Freddie hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I don't know how many more nights like this I have in me." The words hung heavy in the room. Roger shifted uncomfortably. "You've said that before." Freddie met his eyes. "I've never meant it like this." Silence followed, not shocked, but sobered. Brian leaned forward. "Is this about the knees?" Freddie exhaled. "It's about everything they meant." He stood slowly, walking toward the window, his back to them. The city lights reflected faintly against the glass, turning him into a silhouette. "I felt it," Freddie continued. "The exact moment when my body decided for me." He turned back toward them. "I wasn't performing. I was admitting something." Roger swallowed hard. That you're tired? That I'm finite, Freddie replied softly. No one argued. They had seen it too. Freddie returned to the bed and sat again, shoulders slumped slightly, not defeated, but honest. I don't want the last image people have of me to be collapse. Brian's voice tightened. Then it won't be. I want it to be intention, Freddie said. Choice. Roger nodded slowly. You're talking about stepping back. Freddie didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think I already have. The room felt suddenly smaller. Brian stood and placed a hand on Freddie's shoulder. Whatever you choose, he said firmly. You don't do it alone. Freddie smiled faintly. You've always been there when the noise stopped. They sat together for a long time, sharing memories without urgency, laughing softly at moments only they remembered, allowing nostalgia to ease the weight pressing on them. Eventually, Roger stood. Get some rest, he said. We'll talk more tomorrow. Freddie nodded. After they left, the room fell quiet again. Freddie stood once more and approached the mirror. He looked at himself, not as an icon, not as a performer, but as a man who had given everything he had to the world, and perhaps had finally reached a point where he needed to give something back to himself. I didn't know it would feel like this, he whispered. Not sadness, not fear, relief. Freddie lay down slowly, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, but his mind was calm. He thought of the crowd's voices lifting him, of the way they had unknowingly carried him through what might have been his last full performance. They hadn't demanded strength. They had offered love. That thought stayed with him as sleep finally claimed him. When morning came, Freddie woke with an unmistakable certainty. That moment on stage had not been accidental. It had been a farewell, not announced, not explained, but deeply felt. And now, he would have to decide how to honor it. Because the next choice Freddie Mercury made, whether to continue, to retreat, or to redefine everything, would shape how the world remembered his final chapter. But more importantly, it would decide how he lived the time he had left. Morning arrived quietly, as if unwilling to disturb what had settled during the night. Freddie Mercury woke with a calm he hadn't felt in years. His body still ached, reminding him of limits he could no longer ignore, but his mind was clear, startlingly so. The uncertainty that once gnawed at him had softened into something steadier. Acceptance. He sat up slowly, letting the light fill the room. For a long moment, he simply breathed, counting nothing, chasing nothing. The world would expect answers soon. Schedules, announcements, plans. But for now, the morning belonged only to him. Freddie rose and stood at the window, looking out at the city below. Cars moved. People hurried. Life went on, unaware that a quiet decision had already been made. He thought of the stage, the lights, the roar, the moment his knees touched the floor. Not as weakness, not as defeat, but as a conversation he finally agreed to have with himself. On his knees, he had stopped pretending. That mattered. Later that day, Freddie met with the band. There was no dramatic meeting, no speeches rehearsed. Just four men sitting together, bound by years of music and moments no one else could fully understand. I'm not saying goodbye, Freddie said carefully. I'm saying I need to listen. Brian nodded, eyes steady. We hear you. Roger leaned back, exhaling. You don't owe anyone anything. Freddie smiled faintly. I know. That's the first thing I've learned. They spoke about music, about time, about the strange intimacy of endings that don't announce themselves. There were laughs, real ones, and silences that felt earned rather than awkward. No one tried to change his mind. That night, alone again, Freddie returned to piano. He didn't play loudly. He didn't perform. He let his fingers find simple chords, letting sound exist without ambition. He realized something then. For years, he had believed the stage was where he became himself. But the truth was quieter. The stage had amplified who he already was. And now, stepping back didn't mean disappearing. It meant preserving. Freddie thought of the crowd singing him back to himself when his strength had faltered, the way their voices had risen not to demand more, but to give. That moment would live with him, not as a highlight, but as proof. Proof that love didn't require spectacle. Days passed. Freddie rested. He listened. He chose silence more often than noise. And with each day, the weight lifted slightly. Not because the truth changed, but because he no longer fought it. People would talk. They always did. They would debate whether that kneeling moment had been intentional, symbolic, theatrical. Some would call it genius. Others would call it exhaustion disguised as art. Freddie didn't correct them. The truth belonged to him. In quieter hours, he wrote letters, not statements for the press, but notes to people who mattered. Gratitude, honesty, closure. He wrote without flourish, without drama, and sealed each envelope with care. He didn't feel like he was preparing to leave. He felt like he was choosing how to stay. When he thought of the stage again, it wasn't with longing or grief. It was with respect. The stage had given him everything, and he had given it all he had. Now he knew the bravest thing was not to stand taller, but to step away intact. On the evening the city lights flickered on again, Freddie stood once more at the window. He placed a hand lightly against the glass, grounding himself in the present. "I was loud," he said softly to the empty room, "and I was honest. That's enough. The kneeling moment will become legend. A frozen image replayed endlessly, analyzed, admired. People would say it was the night Freddie Mercury bowed to his audience. But they would be wrong. He hadn't bowed to anyone. He had listened to himself. And in doing so, he had turned a moment of vulnerability into an act of courage. Because not every farewell needs words. Some are spoken with the body. Some are whispered in silence. Some happen when a man finally chooses dignity over denial. Freddie Mercury didn't leave the stage that night broken. He left it whole. And that, more than applause, more than myth, was his final gift. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves Freddie Mercury. If this story inspired you, remember, even legends face battles unknown to the world. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves Freddie Mercury.